families, creating a lifetime of memories. Sadly, some families are denied these important moments due to the sad practice of alienation. These are families divided.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Families Divided TV. In this week's edition, Dr. William Bernet joins us in two different segments, speaking to us on the topic misinformation regarding parental alienation. We're going to also hear from Lisa Rothfuss, who will be one of our presenters at our International Virtual Fall Conference. And we're looking forward to having many of you join us for that. It's going to be an exciting time with great information. And Lisa will let you know what she'll be speaking on there. We'll be back in just a minute, right after these messages.
At Victor's Crown, our focus is on you, our clients. When you arrive, our goal is that you will feel at home, from our welcoming atmosphere to our serene surroundings. Everything we do at Victor's Crown is done with our clients in mind. We have comfortable seating areas for both adults and children. A large screen TV with surround sound where clients can be occupied with wholesome entertainment while they wait. We offer complimentary refreshments such as coffee, tea, water, and snacks. Due to the present COVID pandemic, our in-person appointments are restricted to selected cases, and those are held in our luxurious outdoor open-air meeting space that we affectionately refer to as the COVID Cabana, which was built specifically for our clients to offer them the most comfortable and relaxing outdoor space available. All our other clients are offered secured web-based telemed sessions where they can connect with us from anywhere in the world.
Divorce and co-parenting are a major life interruption for families, especially the kids, but also for parents and grandparents. And it's even worse in blame-filled, high-conflict cases. When parents engage in alienation by turning the kids against the other parent or grandparents, kids suffer. They're denied the opportunity to build the 4 big skills necessary for future resilience. New Ways for Families online class can help. Parents learn to use our popular BIF and EAR skills to calm the conflict and stop the hostile emails and texts. And we even have a class for kids and parents to learn together. Research shows a 75% improvement in joint parental decision-making after this course is taken, plus overall improvements for kids' well-being. Don't wait to make this affordable investment in your children's future and improve your well-being too. Start learning new ways for your family today at conflictplaybook.com.
Hi, this is Dr. Bill Bernet, and I'm going to be talking today about misinformation. And what I'm referring to is misinformation or false information or fake news about parental alienation. This happens a lot. Misinformation happens a lot in journal articles, in magazines, in newspapers, and in presentations that are made. And I think that people who are interested in this topic and the topic of parental alienation need to be aware that a lot of things that you see or that you read are not correct. They're fake. And I'm going to give you 3 or 4 examples of that right now. So here's one. This was in a book that was published by the American Psychological Association a year or so ago. And this is what it said: that parental alienation theory assumes that a child's strong alignment with one parent while rejecting a relationship with the other parent is without legitimate justification. So what's wrong with that? What's wrong with it is that it says that we who are interested in parental alienation, that we assume that the child's rejection is without justification. And nobody assumes that. We do an investigation, we collect information, we find out information from the child and from other people. So nobody would assume that just because the child rejects a parent, that it's because of parental alienation. Here's another example. This was written in a book. The use of parental alienation is now considered inadmissible in a number of courts as it does not meet the established legal standard for the admissibility of expert testimony. So what's wrong with that? Well, it's totally false. It is false to say that the concept of parental alienation is not admissible in court. And in fact, there are hundreds of examples. In the recent book that we published called Parental Alienation, Science and Law, the appendix has almost 1,200 cases in the United States in which parental alienation was presented and considered by courts. So it's really just false to say that it's not accepted in court. Here's another one. Somebody wrote this in an article. In these types of cases, whenever a preferred parent speaks poorly about the rejected parent, it is viewed as an alienating behavior. Is that correct? Is it true to say that any time a parent speaks badly about the other parent, that's an example of an alienating behavior? Well, that's not true. That's not a correct statement. I mean, parents say negative things, unfortunate things about the other parent lots of times. It's very common. And it doesn't mean just because that happens that that's an alienating behavior. So that's a fake information. That's misinformation. Here's just one more that actually got to the House of Representatives of the United States Congress. That there was a resolution being considered with the following phrase in it. Whereas scientifically unsound theories such as parental alienation syndrome, enmeshment, and some other things are frequently applied to reject parents' reports of abuse. So that phrase, that parental alienation syndrome is a scientifically unsound theory, that was about to be passed by the House of Representatives. But we intervened. I went and some other people went, talked to congressmen, wrote letters, contacted people, and that phrase was taken out. So that just is an example of how serious this kind of misinformation can be if the actual House of Representatives could have passed a resolution with that phrase. Fortunately, it was removed. So what does all this mean? What it means is you have to be really careful about what you read. You can't believe everything that you read. If you're reading something or seeing in a meeting or a conference something that doesn't seem to make sense, don't automatically believe it. You need to go back to the original source and see what was actually said in the beginning, because what you may be hearing misinformation. Thank you. Our topic today has to do with false information or misinformation that's published regarding parental alienation. The official title is False Information Regarding Parental Alienation and What to Do About It. So there's a lot of information that's been published in journals, in book chapters and books regarding parental alienation. My colleagues and I developed a database, and we located hundreds of articles in peer-reviewed journals regarding this topic. In addition to this literature, there are also articles and book chapters written by critics or detractors of the concept of parental alienation theory. And what we're going to talk about today is that some of these articles by PA critics contain information that is incorrect. And so we encourage people who are interested in this topic to read literature, to read articles. Now there are even articles frequently in newspapers and magazines. So we encourage you to read this material, but in doing so, you need to be careful. You need to be somewhat scrupulous about what you're finding there, because even though most of it I think is correct, occasionally you will find some articles that have misinformation. And I'm going to give you examples of how this works. So here's my first example, and this is pretty simple. This is simply a statement about Richard Gardner, which says, Richard Gardner was implicated as being a proponent of pedophilia. So Richard Gardner was the child psychiatrist who first described parental alienation. And he's the one who called it parental alienation syndrome. This was back in 1985. But people who don't like his ideas have said many, many negative and false things about him. This is a false statement that he was a proponent of pedophilia. Now, he's now deceased, but even during his lifetime, Dr. Gardner took steps to refute and rebut the information that was said about him. And so in this next slide, we can see what he said. He said, I consider pedophilia to be a psychiatric disorder, an abominable exploitation of children. I have never supported a pedophile in his or her quest for primary child custody. And he said, he goes on, I believe that pedophilia is a bad thing for society. So what people are saying about him is flatly false. If he were still alive, I suppose he could be suing these people for libel or something like that. Part of what has happened is that he was a very prolific writer, and he did write about pedophilia occurring in different cultures. He wrote about how in ancient cultures in Greece and Rome, pedophilia occurred, and even now in certain cultures in the world, pedophilia might occur. But he doesn't approve it. Just the fact that he writes about it as a historical fact never meant that he was approving. So here's another example of misinformation that's a little bit more complicated. I think we're going to have to read this together. Parental alienation proponents have been guilty of circular reasoning since Gardner's day, in that they have omitted the collection of data about one parent's persuasive efforts, but have nevertheless assumed that contact refusal is in itself evidence that the preferred parent has carried out a campaign of denigration. So what this is basically saying is these critics are saying that what we say is that whenever we see a child who is refusing contact, who's manifesting contact refusal, that we're saying, we're assuming that that's being caused by a parent who's doing alienation. And that's incorrect. That's not what we're assuming at all. In fact, in the next slide, I would point out that no proponent of parental alienation has ever written in a book or an article that contact refusal is in itself evidence that the preferred parent has carried out a campaign of denigration. What would we say? Proponents of parental alienation theory would say that to make the diagnosis of parental alienation, you have to have two things. You have to have both the behavioral signs in the child that are characteristic of this disorder, and also you have to have evidence that the alienating parent, that the preferred parent has engaged in alienating behaviors. You have to have both of that. We don't do what we're being accused of doing. This is a very common statement in the literature by critics of parental alienation. It's very common for them to say that we assume that whenever we see an alienated child or a child with, whenever we see a child with contact refusal, that it's caused by an alienating parent. We don't say that at all, but that's a false statement that's been said many times. In fact, I've done some research on that, and I have uncovered actually more than 80 examples in the published literature or in government documents even that make that false statement. So here's another example of misinformation. And this has to do with a pretty famous book chapter by a man named Michael Saney, in which he and his colleagues reviewed the research regarding parental alienation. And they said that there is some good research, there is some very good research, but there's also more research that needs to be done. So this book chapter has been quoted many, many times. It's quoted by PA proponents to support the idea that some of the research is very good, and it's quoted by PA critics to say that there still needs to be more to be done. But here's a quote from a PA critic who quotes the book, this chapter by Saney, and then they say, as such, none of this work has reached a point of scientific credibility. And they're attributing that opinion that none of it has reached a point of scientific credibility. They're attributing that to Michael Saney and his colleagues. Well, that's a false statement. That's not what he said. In fact, in the next slide, I'll show you a quotation of what Dr. Saney actually said, which was, there's a remarkable agreement about the behavioral strategies parents can use to potentially manipulate their children's feelings. In other words, they're saying that there's adequate research about the 17 alienating behaviors. That's what the alienating parents do. And there's also research about the cluster of symptoms or behaviors indicating the presence of alienation in the child. So he's saying exactly what we've been saying, that to make the diagnosis, you need the behaviors in the child, and you also need the alienating activities of the preferred parent. And Saney and his colleagues are saying that there's a lot of research on those two things. They're not saying that there's no research, there's no credibility to the research. So that's a false statement that critics say somewhat frequently. Here's another one. Now, this is quoting Gardner, who said that children in parental alienation situations were unusual in that they unambivalently saw one parent as good and the other as bad. And then later what it says is, that's an assumption that parental alienation theorists continue with that assumption. Such assumptions are implausible without empirical documentation that there are cognitive differences of this kind between alienated children and non-alienated children. So that's a good argument. I mean, I think that's correct. That was what Gardner said, that he called it lack of ambivalence, or another way to think about it is Gardner said that these children manifest splitting, which is that one parent is all good and the other parent is all bad. But that, in fact, has been shown. In other words, there has been research, exactly what this critic is saying that should happen. It says that there should be empirical documentation that there are cognitive differences between alienated children and non-alienated children. And here in the next slide is some research that my colleagues and I did, which shows exactly that I'm not going to describe it in detail, but it had to do with a test that we used called the PARQ, P-A-R-Q, which stands for Parental Acceptance Rejection Questionnaire. And we used that questionnaire to distinguish alienated from non-alienated children. And you can see that on the right-hand slide, the right-hand part of this slide, in red columns are the alienated children, and they all had certain scores on this test that we call the PARQ gap, and that the non-alienated children had low scores. And this test, all by itself, was 99% effective. It was 99% correct in distinguishing the alienated from the non-alienated children. So my point is that the exact research that the critics say should be done, I mean, that's been done. And so you have to be really careful about what you read. Here, I have one more example of misinformation, and this has to do with me. The misinformation says Bernet in 2013 reports that the American Psychiatric Association refused to include parental alienation in the DSM-5 because of scientific limitations on research. Well, they're not correctly quoting me. In the next slide, I explain better what was said. In other words, this has to do with our attempt to get parental alienation into the DSM-5. And we were 50% successful, meaning that we got the concept in, but we didn't get the actual words. And the APA people, what's called the DSM-5 task force, never said there was not enough research regarding parental alienation at all. What they said is there was not enough research for it to be considered a mental disorder, but there was enough research for it to be called a mental condition. Those are two different things. Mental conditions are things like relational problems. There's a chapter in the DSM-5 for relational problems and other mental conditions, and that's where parental alienation ended up. For instance, there's a relational problem called child affected by parental relationship distress, and there's another one called parent-child relational problem, and both of these have definitions that are paraphrases of parental alienation definition. So it's incorrect to say there is not enough research. What they're saying is there's not enough research for it to be considered what they call a mental disorder, but there is enough research for it to be called a relational problem. And in fact, in the next slide, just as an example, you know, people say, well, how much research is there? And my colleagues and I found hundreds of articles and book chapters and books in the professional literature from many, many countries, from at least 38 countries. So actually the overall research on this topic is almost overwhelming. So let's go on to the idea of what can people do when psychiatrists and psychologists read these journal articles. What should they be thinking? And actually anybody, parents or grandparents or the general public who read these articles, here are some things they should be thinking. And if you do find an error, which you may, here are some things you can do. And so I'm going to go through a list of things. Some of these we have in fact done, and I'll try to describe whether or not they worked. For instance, if you're reading a journal article or just a magazine article and there's incorrect information, what can you do? You can write a letter to the editor. So we've done that. We've sent a letter to the editor of this journal called Monitor on Psychology, to a psychiatric newspaper called Clinical Psychiatric News, and a journal called Journal of Forensic Sciences. And in some instances, this was effective. Like several people wrote to the Monitor on Psychology, and they wrote a correction. Several people wrote a complaint to Clinical Psychiatry News, and they wrote an actual retraction that the man who wrote the original misinformation published in his next column a retraction that what he had previously said was incorrect. Okay, so that's a fairly simple thing to do. Here's another thing you can do, which is make a formal complaint to the publisher. Now, this has to do with the books. And there's a publisher in Stockholm, Sweden, called Norstedts Juridik, which published a book that had serious errors in it. And also, even the American Psychological Association published a book that has errors in it. So my colleagues and I wrote to these publishers with mixed results. The publisher in Sweden basically said, no, they're not going to do anything. They basically said, here in Sweden, people who write books can say just about anything they want because that's their concept of freedom of the press. But the American Psychological Association did agree that the thing that we were complaining about, at least partly they agreed, was incorrect. And they, in fact, made a correction and to the thing that we objected to. So sometimes that's successful. Here's another thing you can do that's a little bit more complicated, which has published a rebuttal in the same journal. So what happens is a journal will publish an article that has mistakes in it, or it's written by a parental alienation detractor or critic. And so my colleagues and I go to the journal editor and we say, we want to publish another article about this topic that we think is more balanced. And many, many journal editors agree with that. In other words, they feel it's their mission to publish both sides of arguments, or both sides of scientific discussions. And so we've done this in several journals: the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, another one, the American Journal of Family Therapy, Children and Youth Services Review, and Family Court Review. These are all very good journals, and they all publish material that we considered incorrect. And they all agreed to publish another article that we thought was more suitable. So here's another idea: create a blog. So I've never done that, and my colleagues haven't, but that would be kind of interesting to do, to create a blog that specifically addresses false information. And you can call the blog Fake News About Parental Alienation. I know some listeners of this are kind of interested in media and so on, and you might want to do that. If you do, let me know. I'd be interested to see how it turns out. The next one is a little bit more complicated. The suggestion is file an ethics complaint. For instance, if the person is a member of the American Psychological Association, you can file a complaint with them, or you can file a complaint with the State Board of Psychology. That doesn't usually work. They're usually not very interested in doing anything about it. But the next one is interesting. The next one is meet with your congressman. My colleagues and I actually did that. There was a resolution that was being considered by the United States House of Representatives, and it had errors in it And we met with the congressman, and they changed it so that when it was eventually passed a year later, it did not have those errors. So that was pretty dramatic. Another thing people can do if you really want to is write a book. And so obviously that's a pretty big project, but my colleagues and I have done that. We wrote one book called Parental Alienation, the Handbook for Mental Health and Legal Professionals, and another book called Parental Alienation, Science and Law. And finally, if you want to try to correct misinformation, you can make a presentation. And that's what we're doing right now. So I hope that this has been interesting. There's one more thought I want to leave with you, which is that if you're interested in this topic, look up our website for Parental Alienation Study Group. And if you want to, get in touch and join the organization. It's a good way to stay in touch with each other, and it's a good way to continue to learn about parental alienation. So thank you for your attention, and we wish you the best.
Have you ever had a parent come into your office and repeatedly tell you all of the negative characteristics and behaviors of their co-parent? Have you ever had a child come into your office and tell you all of the negative experience they've had with their parent? Every single day in my office, I see families who are so stuck in their memories of the past, they can't move forward into a more positive future together. My name is Lisa Rothfuss, and I'm a psychotherapist here in Austin, Texas, with 35 years of experience working with children and families. I specialize in working in high-conflict families, families who are struggling with alienation, and families who are wanting to reunify. I will be talking about how to move beyond these limiting mindsets that keep our families stuck in the past and help them move towards a more future-focused reunification process. This is a workshop that's for all family members and clinicians wanting to affect change in their relationships and in their therapeutic practice.
On next week's Families Divided TV, attorney Jordan Trager speaks with Dr. Colleen Murray regarding legal options for grandparents.